Hi, it's Richard here with the next chapter in the Siebel and OPA webinar from the OPA Hub. So we're going to talk about setting up a connection, what that means, and intrinsically what we have to do. Here's the agenda. So the prerequisites and what you're going to need to do to get everything so that you can follow along to some of the other videos. The role of the white paper. So we're focusing on Siebel Innovation Pack 16, and there is a white paper produced by Oracle describing an integration technique, which is the one that we're using in this webinar. And you'll learn in there about the files that come with the white paper, what you need to install, what you may need to change, and then we'll look at the basic methods that we're going to implement. Both metadata methods for design time and data methods for runtime. Prerequisites, you need WebLogic started and your server for OPA started, which assumes that you have an OPA environment, and we spoke in a previous chapter about where you can find out how to do that. You need obviously an instance of Siebel 16 for the purposes of kind of making it as easy as possible. This course was built on top of Siebel 16.0 out of the box, no patches installed, kind of, if you like, as a proof that it's going to work. If your Siebel 16 instance uses workspaces, in which case then you will need to adapt some of what you'll see to using a child workspace and compiling and committing all those modifications instead of just compiling like we used to do. In the videos, we don't go through the process of using a local database, checking out and all that. Any changes you see us making are done on the server database and the server SRF. But of course, if you have your own check-in, check-out and other release procedures, then you need to follow them. Your Siebel server needs to be up and running, and the EAI Object Manager, in whatever language you want to use, needs to be enabled. We use the ENU one in this course, but from my experience, it'll work fine on other languages. I've used it in French, notably. And I guess the biggest prerequisite is that the white paper includes a zip file, and in the zip file are a bunch of objects. So the link you can see there is the link to the article which introduces the white paper. And at the top of the article, you can download the zip file and a bunch of other stuff. So this white paper, it was introduced as a plan for customers using Siebel and OPA 12, specifically Siebel IP16 and OPA 12, because in Siebel IP 15.5 and beyond, there was already an integration with OPA, but it was quite onerous in terms of putting it into place and maintaining it and keeping it as generic as possible. So essentially, the white paper and the existing integration in Siebel IP 15.5 serve a similar purpose, but they have differences in capability, and they have differences in what's supported, and they have differences in what you can do. So let's take a look on the next page at some of the differences between the IP16 and the IP 15.5 integration. So this is actually taken from the white paper, and as you can see, it's a functionality comparison. The basic principle, if you take a look down the different columns, is that the Siebel OpenUI OPA applet aka IP15 integration is OpenUI driven. So really, in 15.5, we used OpenUI to generate the UI. Even we were generating the UI of OPA, but we were generating it inside Siebel. Whereas in the IP16 integration, we're using the native interviews that OPA delivers. So the user interface is delivered by OPA. The key thing for me, at least, is that down here, the OPA controls supported, and the fifth line. The IP15 integration had a subset of the visual components that OPA has, because there was no one-to-one match between Siebel OpenUI's controls, text controls, calendar controls, and so on, and the native controls in OPA. And OPA evolved much faster, being a cloud product. It evolved very quickly, and there were lots of control types that you couldn't implement in the integration with IP 15.5. Whereas now with the white paper, because you're using the native OPA interface, you get everything, all the richness that OPA provides, embedded into Siebel. So, what next? Here's a kind of history lesson. It can be useful because, as you'll see later on, you may need something from one of these integrations, even if you're implementing the IP16 white paper. In OPA 10, the integration architecture was different for various reasons, not least of which the OPA architecture has changed between 10 and 12. Fundamentally, in OPA 10, integrating with Siebel was a black box that you imported into Siebel, which gave you extra administration screens where you would create mappings, think of them as data mappings, and then you would use traditional techniques like symbolic URLs to embed graphically OPA into Siebel. OPA 12, both of the integrations, really it was redesigned from the ground up. Instead of using a connector, which is essentially a bunch of business services in Siebel, a bunch of DLLs, black box stuff, an attempt was made to leverage as much as possible the architecture of Siebel to get things done. So in the IP15 integration, there are objects inside Siebel, but we reuse a lot of what's in OPA. There was a lot of XSL transformations and HTML transformations even to create layouts that look like OPA, but actually we're using Siebel OpenUI. And we use standard integration techniques that anyone could look at. So we're talking about workflow processes and web services that you could go and study and copy and use for your own integrations. The IP16 white paper goes one step further in the sense that it's become even more generic. There's large pieces of the integration now that if you need to make a new embedded interview or a new embedded OPA window, you can copy and paste. You can take existing stuff, existing workflows, make minor changes, and off you go. You'll notice the 3 bullet points under the IP16 integration. One, because of improvements in the OPA architecture, you don't even need to use an iframe to embed OPA. There's actually an OPA JavaScript object, which you could manipulate in OpenUI to start a session. We actually looked at that in the OPA Hub. You can probably find an article on the Hub about it. It's running as native OPA UI. So all of the functionality is supported that you have in OPA, including OPA extensions, graphical extensions, styling extensions. But underneath, it's just about generic workflow processes and web services. So your first job, once you've downloaded the zip file from the white paper, is clearly import that archive file into Siebel Tools. The zip file actually contains a whole bunch of stuff, but I was looking in the archive file, and essentially this zip file contains pretty much everything you need for Siebel Tools. It includes the workflow processes, it includes the integration objects that map to the data exchange with OPA. So you'll need to import all of those, do a compile, publish, and activate. Now, I want you to look at the 4th point here. Look at the names of the workflows. OPA get checkpoint, OPA load for PUB sample intake contact, process submit. These are all, if you like, template workflows, so that if tomorrow you need to implement an integration with OPA that uses a different business object than contact, opportunity, or whatever it is, these workflows that are supplied in the zip, you're going to be able to take those workflows, and you'll still need to make some changes, but by and large, you'll be well on your way to building another integration with OPA. If you're not that familiar with OPA, it's important to remember that when OPA and Siebel communicate, we're going to be communicating using the typical integration object, integration component, or business object, business component stuff. So you might have one OPA interview which runs talking about opportunities, and another OPA interview that runs talking about assets, and therefore you'll need to use different workflow configuration to tell it which integration object to use, for example. And you probably guessed that that would mean we'll also need to configure a web service, one web service to pull opportunity data, one to pull contact data, and so on. But we'll look at all of this in more detail later. Inside the zip file, there isn't just a CIF. You'll also find some XSL files, which you'll need to push into the XSLT folder of your Siebel server, or if you're using the client, into your thick client. And some of the workflows currently have embedded in them dumping the files to ctemp. So if you don't have a ctemp where you're running Siebel, you will need to make a ctemp folder, or you'll need to make adjustments to the workflow. We point it out in the videos later on, so you'll know where to change it. The XSL files, in typical Siebel style, are used for property set transformation, essentially, swapping backwards and forwards between OPA and Siebel, and in some cases, removing extraneous tags that we don't need. Obviously, if you're going to integrate OPA and Siebel, you need at least one, in our case, one interview from OPA, one thing that you want to show in Siebel. So in our example, we're going to use a very generic interview, which has some rules behind it, hence the name rule base, that works with contact. So we're going to use an integration object called PUB sample contact. We'll talk about it later. But essentially, if you're going to use a different integration object, then we'll highlight when you need to make changes. Finally, also in the zip file, you will have an inbound web service. So this inbound web service is, as its name suggests, generic. It's a generic template. For our purposes, we're going to modify that template to make it work with our integration object and our interview. If you're going to use it multiple times, remember that when you import a web service and you try and create methods for that web service, you often get issues because Siebel tells you that you have a duplicate method, etc. So if you don't need to import this into an environment, import it into sample, take a look at it and copy and paste so that you could move the definitions into another environment. And if you are going to import it and you are going to make the modifications in the exercises that we walk you through, don't forget that anytime you make a change to one of those inbound web service definitions, clear cache, generate the WSDL so that we can test it. And in this course, you will see us testing, first of all, in SOAP UI, and where appropriate, you'll see us testing for real in Siebel and in OPA, so you get to see from end to end. So to make life a little more spicy, rather than importing that generic web service and just saying, hey, it works, we're going to build that web service step by step. So we'll go through the process of building what is essentially supplied in that generic web service. We feel that by showing you how to build the pieces, you'll be better equipped to use it because you'll know what they're all about. And this is just a screenshot to remind you that if you start copying the web service or trying to duplicate it or import it twice, even if you've renamed the web service in the meantime, you're likely to get errors like this. I'm sure many of you have come across this, is that the ports, for whatever reason, don't get deleted when you delete the service. So you might need to do a bit of cleaning up and so on. So we're not going to import the web service. We're going to build it from scratch. Anyway, so what exactly does all this mean, getting Siebel connected? It means that, as you can see in this screenshot, in Oracle Policy Automation, we're going to create something called a connection. A connection can be with Siebel, or it can be with Service Cloud, or it can be with an online database, it can be with an application. It's an abstraction. OPA has no clue what is behind there. We know it's Siebel, but it doesn't. It just thinks of it as a web service. That web service has to respond in certain ways to calls by OPA. Otherwise, OPA will not recognize what it's for. And the first kind of call that you'll ever meet in OPA is something called CheckAlive. It's essentially a ping. It's a method that OPA uses to make sure that metadata is available. Data is available. The workflow that is supplied in the zip file is entirely generic, and you only ever need it once. You don't need to create another one. Even if you create new interviews and embed them with inside Siebel, you can reuse this workflow absolutely, completely, all the time. We still walk you through using it and what it does and why it's useful, but the good news is it's completely reusable. The second method, the second call that you're ever going to make between OPA and Siebel is probably one of the most important ones. It's called GetMetaData. And as you might say, well, the name is written on the tin. It's a step that is especially important at design time. What I mean is, if you look at this screenshot, there's somebody here inside Oracle Policy Modeling. They're modeling business rules in OPA, and they want to model rules that map to business components and fields in Siebel. I don't know, they want to calculate a discount on an order, and to do that they need to map to the order management and the sales order and the order lines. So this is an important call. OPA wants Siebel to respond to a GetMetaData method with a set of information about your integration object. But of course, it won't be just a Siebel integration object. It will have to have been transformed into something that OPA can understand. Typically, the workflow process that is provided as an example, you can pretty much use as is. There's a few modifications you'd have to make. Notably, you'd have to make sure that you actually referenced the correct integration object. We'll walk you through using it both in SOAP UI and actually for real in the Oracle Policy Modeling tool. So now we're ready to show you how to set up those first two methods, CheckAlive and GetMetaData. We'll also illustrate the first steps of creating the inbound web service call so that Siebel can receive these calls and respond correctly. Then once you've built the inbound web service, we'll generate the WSDL and show you how to test them in SOAP UI, and we'll give you some advice in the video about where you're likely to want to edit the workflow processes that are provided. It's important to remember that the workflow processes that are provided are just examples. Sometimes they do need to be modified a little, or certain things need to be changed to make them more industrial, if you will. Right through the video, we give you troubleshooting information. Let me be completely honest, is the videos were recorded live, so you'll see me going backwards and forwards and editing something and reminding myself to do something. This is so that you, when you go through the same steps, you will also see where you're likely to have problems. See you in a few minutes after the video. I'm assuming that you've watched the video now, or if you haven't, you're about to. Here are some of the really core troubleshooting messages that everybody needs to know about. One, a lot of them, and we mentioned this in the video, reference C/temp. So if you don't have it, you're going to need it, or you're going to need to edit it. Secondly, a few of the workflow processes still have default strings for some of their process properties. It's not a big deal, but you'll want to tidy this up. Notice the subpoint. The submit workflow process, which is when Siebel is receiving information from OPA, will, in my opinion at least, need to have additional steps added to process what you receive from OPA. Now that might be an eScript business service, or it might be, if you're really lucky, some kind of XML converter steps. We'll mention the kind of thing you'll have to do in that business service, but it's a given that the workflow that you already have, that is called OPA submit pub contact, whatever it is, you're going to need to update it. The final point, and this is kind of valid for all of these workflows, all of these web service calls, is when building the inbound web service, they all use a metadata filter service, one for the request and one for the response. These are business services used to trim off or remove extraneous empty tags. If you forget them when you're building the inbound web service, as I often do, you will notice already that when you're testing your web service in SOAP UI, you have a bunch of tags that don't do anything. In fact, they're empty, and you need to remove them to get your web service to work. It's a sure sign that you've forgotten to populate those in the inbound web service. And we highlight that in the video. Kind of basic stuff is, don't forget that this is based on integration objects and integration components that need to be compiled. In my environment, you'll see me doing it is I'm using the deploy feature of Siebel Tools, where you can push new versions of integration objects that can be used immediately because it's much quicker than stopping the server and compiling and all that. And there's a dead obvious one at the end, but this can trap you, especially when we're talking about checkpoints. When you look at those methods, is you need to have everything up to date, business object, business components, and tables, and synced logical and physical schema.